The year is 1823. The place is the United States, a young nation finding its way in a world dominated by European powers. Enter stage left, the Monroe Doctrine. This wasn't some dry legal document gathering dust on a shelf. It was a bold proclamation delivered by President James Monroe himself. Imagine him, standing tall, declaring to the world that the Americas were off-limits to further European colonization. Talk about making an entrance. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't just about keeping Europe out, it was about America stepping up, establishing itself as the big kid on the playground. It was a defining moment, a signal that the US was ready to play a more prominent role on the world stage. Buckle up because things are about to get interesting. Picture this. It's the early 1800s. Napoleon is busy conquering Europe, leaving Spain and Portugal with little time or energy to manage their vast empires in the Americas. Seizing the opportunity, Latin American colonies rise up, kicking off a wave of revolutions. It's messy, it's chaotic, but by the 1820s, many of these colonies have declared independence. The US, meanwhile, is watching all of this unfold with a mixture of anxiety and ambition. They see the potential for European meddling in the Americas as a direct threat to their own security and interests. This is where the Monroe Doctrine comes in. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't just some vague statement about America being the boss, it laid out some specific ground rules for how the US saw the Western Hemisphere working. First, there's the principle of non-colonization. The message to Europe was clear: no new colonies allowed. Second, the doctrine emphasized non-interference. The US pledged not to meddle in the internal affairs of European nations or their existing colonies. Third, the Monroe Doctrine established the idea of separate spheres of influence. Finally, the doctrine declared that any attempt by a European power to transfer colonies in the Americas to another European power would be viewed as hostile. These principles formed the bedrock of the Monroe Doctrine, shaping US foreign policy for generations. Now, you might think that after this grand pronouncement the world would shake in its boots and European powers would scurry away. Well, not quite. The truth is, the Monroe Doctrine didn't exactly have the most impactful start. European powers mostly ignored the Monroe Doctrine at first, knowing that the US didn't really have the muscle to back it up. But even without immediate impact, the Monroe Doctrine planted a seed. It became a cornerstone of American exceptionalism. This idea that the US had a unique destiny to fulfill on the world stage. It became a powerful symbol of American ambition and a justification for US intervention in the affairs of its hemispheric neighbors. Fast forward a few decades, and the US is looking a lot less like that scrawny kid and a lot more like a heavyweight boxer. They've flexed their muscles in the Mexican-American War, expanded westward, and are well on their way to becoming a global power. And guess what? They've dusted off the old Monroe Doctrine and given it a bit of a makeover. Enter President Theodore Roosevelt, a man known for his big stick diplomacy. In 1904, he introduces the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. It's basically the Monroe Doctrine on steroids, declaring that the US has the right to intervene in the affairs of Latin American nations to maintain stability and protect American interests. Imagine the US as a self-appointed hall monitor patrolling the Western Hemisphere, ready to step in and restore order whenever it sees fit. Of course, restoring order often meant protecting US business interests or propping up friendly regimes, regardless of what the people in those countries actually wanted. The Roosevelt Corollary ushered in an era of US interventionism in Latin America. The US intervened militarily in Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, often with disastrous consequences for those countries. The Monroe Doctrine, once a statement about preventing European colonialism, had become a tool for US imperialism. The irony, of course, was not lost on many Latin Americans. So, what's the legacy of the Monroe Doctrine? Well, it's complicated. On the one hand, it did help to prevent further European colonization in the Americas. It also established the US as the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere, for better or for worse. But on the other hand, the Monroe Doctrine cast a long shadow over US-Latin American relations. It was used to justify countless interventions, propping up dictators, undermining democratically elected governments, and generally throwing its weight around. It created a legacy of resentment and mistrust that continues to this day. The Monroe Doctrine might be a relic of the 19th century, but its impact is still felt in the 21st. It's a story that continues to shape how we understand the relationship between the US and its neighbors to the south.